So many people are looking to live happier, more stress-free lives. We provide interviews from mental health experts across various fields because we know finding quality information isn't always easy. Let's find more sanity together. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Sanity Podcast. We have a previous guest coming back on, Scott Waltman, Dr. Scott Waltman. Going to do a quick introduction here because many people know him online by his very funny Instagram handle. But beyond that, he's a known national and international trainer. Scott, what's the Instagram handle that you go by?
Oh, God. I mean, you make these things before you realize you're going to be stuck with it forever. And you like your email address you make as a kid and you have forever. But my Instagram handle is Socratic Method CBT.
Check out. It is a very funny meme page worth checking out. Well, Scott is also, like I said, a international, nationally known trainer. He is a clinical psychologist, and I would say a master CBT therapist.
Oh, thank you.
Just a few of his more recent accolades. Last year, he was the global ambassador to the World Confederation of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. He is the incoming president in not one, but two organizations, the Academy of Cognitive and Behavioral Therapies. I just got my certification from the Academy, so thank you very much from the organization. Thank you. And the International Association of Cognitive Behavioral Therapies. And he's also an author of several books, and he has a previous book on Socratic method, Socratic questioning, hence his Instagram handle, and I believe a book on Stoicism, which we're going to be talking about today. And segueing from that, you also have a podcast that's based in Stoicism that's coming out as well, right?
Yeah, we do. So we just barely launched this new podcast. We're doing one focused on healthy relationships and Stoicism. Sometimes Stoicism gets like overcorrected into this idea of like catch flights, not feelings, no connection. But that's not really what Stoicism is about. So we have a podcast, which is like a little irreverent. We try to make it entertaining. But the title of it is Parentified and Codependent Present the Rescuer Trap. We're currently writing a book for New Harbinger called The Rescuer Trap, focusing on trying to help people, focus on helping people, but helping people in a way that is sustainable and also has good respect for yourself as well. And so the podcast lines up with that, but it's a lot of fun. You can see it wherever you see your podcasts.
Great. And you're a few episodes in now, right? So people have a little catch up that they could do if they want to.
Yeah, you can do some binge listening if you want to.
Okay, great. All right. I love coming at the podcast like this when it's a topic that I don't know too much about. Like some podcasts I come in and it's like out of an area that I have an expertise in and I kind of know the answers to the questions that I'm asking. But this one is actually pretty new knowledge for me. So I'm going to kind of just bring it all the way back to like, what is Stoicism and why should any of us care?
Yeah, fantastic question, right? So Stoicism is a philosophy that comes out of ancient Greece and then Rome. It's really popular right now. If you're involved in podcasts or social media, several books have been written by popular authors like Ryan Holiday with the Daily Stoic. But Stoicism is essentially, it's born out of the wisdom of Socrates, right? So after the death of Socrates, there's a number of branches of Hellenistic philosophy that start up, like skepticism, which is really focused on, well, do I really know what I think I know? And like really weighing evidence, which is a bit of CBT. But the other bit of CBT is looking at like cynicism, Stoicism, which is like, why am I so bothered by these things that are happening? And how do I focus on living a good life where I'm doing what I have control over? So in a sense, Stoicism is learning to focus on living a life guided by your values, focusing on what you have control over, and then trying to redefine happiness, not as like permanent sense of joy or relatedness, like a drug, but really happiness is like meaning and fulfillment to your life, which seems really compatible with modern CBT.
Mm-hmm. And do you think those principles are incredibly aligned with human nature as well, that it's an important thing that we should focus on? Like, is this like 10% important of the human experience, or is this like a bigger portion that people should be focusing on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a lot of universals to Stoicism as well, right? So I run like Stoicism groups with people and we'll talk about these different ideas and quotes and stories. And there's a lot of universals that come in from like Confucianism and from all over the world. We will say it wasn't just like the Greeks and Romans had good ideas and we should listen to them, but people were just like nerding out on philosophy. And so they got cool stuff. But I think it is really, there's a lot of self-evident truths, right? There's things that like once you dig into them, you can say, okay, this makes sense, and it makes sense in different settings across different places. But sometimes it's not, we don't always land in the same place, right? So the Stoics had this idea that really the best way to live a good life is to be not so bothered by discomfort, but focusing on like, am I living up to my own expectations? Am I being a good person? Am I being fair? Am I being just? Am I having courage? So essentially like a good life is a life that's ethical or driven by integrity. At the same time, there were these people called the Epicureans, and they kind of had this idea that a good life would be a life like devoid of like pain and discomfort. And so they kind of made like a little bit of a cult where they sort of retreated and they focus on just trying to avoid discomfort. And there's some value in some of their writing, but it's definitely like a different approach. And you can see that in modern therapy, right? So modern therapy, somebody might come in and they might say, I want to feel better. And some therapists might focus on relaxation, soothing, trying to help soothe you out of your anxiety disorder. I don't know about you, but I've never worked with somebody with an anxiety disorder where we could just relax it away. Because the trouble is you can't stay in that permanent, really relaxed state, right? If you take a Xanax, you feel perfect, but you can't live Xanax. And so part of exposure therapy is you have to learn to be uncomfortable being uncomfortable. You have to learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable. You have to learn to increase your distress tolerance in a sense. So I think really it's kind of like long-term versus short-term. And if you want to have a good life in the long term, then these principles are pretty universal and pretty important.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say this wrong. Epicurean? Did I say that correctly? Oh, great. I'm very proud of myself. I'm not good at pronouncing unknown words for myself. It sounds like almost like the opposite of what we're trying to do in a lot of CBT, which is developing grit, right? Having if you think about like a normal curve, too little discomfort's not healthy. Too much discomfort is probably not healthy. But there is this medium ground of discomfort that if we roll through our lives, ebbing and flowing in there, we tend to be healthier because the idea is not to feel uncomfortable, but to have the tolerance to be uncomfortable and to do it anyway, because life is inherently uncomfortable. And it sounds like that might be a principle of Stoicism. Do I sound like a Stoic philosopher?
That does sound very Stoic,
now?
Yeah. This idea that, essentially the Stoics might say, most things that are worth doing are going to take some discomfort to get there. There's going to be like a rough road you got to climb to get there. And so if you want greatness in your life, that doesn't necessarily mean like greatness like Hall of Fame or greatness like you have all these followers, but greatness might just mean like being really good at what you do. If you want to be like a really good father, there's a lot of heartache that goes with that, right? If you want to be a really good therapist, if you want to be a really good coach, there's a lot of heartache that goes with that. So part of it does have to do with this idea of recognizing that if I could live in a vacuum, then maybe I could control everything and I could just relax myself to this place of serenity, but I can't live in a vacuum, right? The Stoics were unique in that this wasn't an academic philosophy. So they weren't sitting in these like ivory towers pontificating, but it was really, they were in the street in an area called the Painted Porch doing philosophy in real life. This was a philosophy for living, not a philosophy for just musing and thinking.
I'm going back to my high school, I think it was 11th grade high school teacher who is teaching us a bit about Buddhism, and one of the and I know there's different styles of Buddhism, but one of the principles he was talking about was this belief that you could be happy anywhere as long as you have the correct mindset, that you could be in a jail cell, and that was the example he gave, and sit there and be completely happy as long as you have the correct mindset.
Yeah. No, I think it's pretty compatible with Stoicism. Actually, Stoicism is really popular in a number of prison systems because it does speak to this idea about we always have freedom in our minds, right? So one of my favorite Stoics, during the time of ancient Rome, there was this man, Epictetus, who was born in what is modern-day Turkey. He was enslaved for 20 years, and then afterwards, when he eventually received his freedom, he wandered into a lecture hall. Gaius Musonius Rufus was lecturing, who was basically Roman Socrates. And so Rufus and Epictetus have this conversation, and he says, like, I got to teach this guy philosophy. This guy gets it more than I get it. And so Epictetus learns philosophy and becomes like the most influential Stoic philosopher of his time, which is pretty amazing. And then he is wildly influential. Marcus Aurelius, probably the most influential Stoic person ever. So there's this one person, a huge influence. But Epictetus would say things in his writings like, you know, like, you could fetter or you could chain my legs, but you can't chain my mind, right? Like my options might be limited, but I always have a choice. And so the Stoics would really view these our environments as externals. They would say, this is external to me. And then they say, can I control it or I can't control it? If I can't control it, I might have preferences. But if I treat my preferences like demands, that's where I'm going to suffer. Which is exactly what Albert Ellis is saying, right? Ellis is saying, most of the suffering we have in life comes from these demands that we have. We say, you must treat me this specific way. I must always feel this way. And that's a setup. Because, I mean, we have good ideals and life is a meat grinder at times. You have to have some grit to be able to tolerate it.
So I was bringing up a little bit of Buddhist principles before, because it seems like there's newer wave therapies that kind of like are kind of explicit that they might take from Zen Buddhism or areas of that into like the wisdom from some of those practices and pulling it into modern day therapy. It seems like Stoicism isn't as like nobody really, not nobody, because apparently we're talking about it, but there's a lot more recognition of that half of it. Maybe that half of that part of it, the Buddhism part of it. Why do you think that maybe Stoicism, less people are familiar with it? And you're talking about is connected to Ellis. And I know when you wrote over to me, you said Beck was had these ideas, and you could see it throughout CBT. But why do you think it's? And maybe you don't know the answer, but why is this part of it, even if it's intertwined in the therapy we do, have less of a flashlight on it until maybe now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's probably two reasons that drive that. One, I think the word Stoicism isn't unique to Stoicism. And so, like, if you're talking to a Stoic and you say being Stoic, I know that to mean living wisely, focusing on what you have control over, and having feelings, but your feelings aren't driving. So if somebody else hears the word Stoic, they might say, oh, you mean like unemotional? You mean like emotionally repressed? You mean like a really like an unresilient kind of way. And so I think that branding term, right? Because we talked about these ancient philosophies like skepticism, cynicism, stoicism. These all mean something very different from a philosophy perspective than everyday language. And so I think there's a branding issue. And then I think, Ellis and Beck, they cited very explicitly in their early writings that they were influenced by the Stoics, but they don't really do a good job sampling from them. They sort of take this one statement that Epictetus said, which is, Men are bothered by their views of things, not by what actually happens, and said, yeah, cognitive mediation. And they ran with that quote, and they kind of ignored the rest of it. But there's actually a lot more to it than that. And but I think in the therapy world, a lot of us, what we know about Stoicism is what we know from what's been cited by like therapists who've been writing about it. And so a lot of us haven't gone into the original text and read it. And so we think, yeah, we've already covered Stoicism. We got that. We're done, right? Like if you think, like if you go to Philly, right, you can get a Philly cheesesteak, and you might think like this is like the quintessential sandwich for Philly. But anyone who's like actually been in Philly knows there's a lot of quintessential sandwiches in Philly. And actually, you should get an Italian pork roast. You should get it at Nick's. You should get it with the sharp provolone and the broccoli rabe. It'll change your life. But like you wouldn't know that unless you went there. So there's all these like Italian pork roast sandwiches of Stoicism that haven't been consumed yet, and they're delectable.
And so if you were to go back and help rewrite some of these books, what other snapshots would you throw in there? So you said the one, here goes the one that Beck did mention, Ellis did, mention. What are the main ones you would throw in there?
Yeah, I think really I would talk more about virtues, values. I would talk more about like dichotomy of control, or CBT people might call it circle of control, like focusing on what you really have control over. Beck talked a little bit about cognitive distancing, which is sort of like a mindfulness version of what the Stoics might do and try and get some perspective. But I think that'd be a good place to start. I think also we have to see these, the context that these therapies kind of started in, right? So back started as like a theory based, like let's view not protocol, but like principle based approach. And if you read like Cognitive Therapy of Emotional Disorders, it's different than later books. Because later, he really succeeds at randomized controlled trials and sort of develops this like randomized controlled trials like mentality towards therapy in a sense, like comparing protocols instead of thinking more holistically. It could be a pitfall that somebody might see. And Ellis, I think Ellis really lines up pretty well with Stoicism, but a better fit for Stoicism is actually, if you might remember like 10 years ago, people were really excited about the overlap between rationally motivated behavior therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. The Venn diagram of overlap between ACT and REBT is really what Stoicism is. So there's this recognition that a lot of our challenges are coming from places of non-acceptance, the demandingness that we have. But then the goal isn't just to let go of your irrationalities because you're not doing anything. But then the goal is to figure out, well, what do I want to make important in my life and how do I go after that? And I think, so there's a little bit of acceptance, a little bit of like values, a little bit of committed action. And then there's this kind of idea about like living in harmony with nature, sort of the way acceptance is framed within Stoicism. So it's not necessarily that we're doing acceptance because it's maybe spiritually good, like from a Buddhist perspective, where it's maybe like the right answer, but it's more just like, this is the way it is. Like if you want to try and live out of accordance with nature, good luck. There's, so the third head of the Stoic school back in early Greece, Chrysippus had this metaphor where he would say, imagine you're a dog chained to a cart and this cart is moving. This cart is fate. If you're this dog, you have two options, right? You can walk along or you can be dragged. And so there's a saying we say about fate, so either like let it go or be dragged, or you can kind of follow, the way reality is going, or you can try and fight against it, but you can't change what's happening. Which is a challenge, right? So how do you kind of find this place of what I have control over and not fall into the nihilism of it, but also have some level of acceptance? And you have to think about, what do I have control over and what don't I have control over? And as Epictetus is saying, I can't always control my circumstances, right? You could literally chain me up and I can't control that, but I can always control here. I can always control my mind. I can control the choices I'm seeing. I can recognize that I have choices.
That's it. That's an interesting analogy with the you said a dog that's chained.
Yeah.
That's going. Because in that one, like how long is this chain that you have much, because it sounds like part of it is like figuring out your values, moving towards it, trying to make choices that align with nature, but also align with morals. And there also sounds like there's a component of wanting to be successful and that it's hard to be successful. There's a lot of pain and suffering that comes through being successful, whatever that means to you.
Yeah.
But then how does that balance with the idea that you're being dragged to a certain place that you can't control? Like that sounds very deterministic.
It does, right? Yeah. So, but I think, but there are things in life that do happen that are out of our control, right? Even if the cart is maybe like an overly simplified metaphor, there's thousands of things that have happened in your lifetime and my lifetime that have created opportunities and limited opportunities. And there's things that happen and will happen which will affect our life. Absolutely. Good news is we're not literally dogs trained to a cart, but essentially I think about, like, from radical acceptance, from DBT, radical acceptance is really a distress tolerance skill. Right? Distress tolerance skills are really geared towards, how do I not make the situation worse? So if you're in a bad situation, you're in a place where you're about to burn it all down. Radical acceptance reminds you, Scott, don't burn it all down. Don't make it worse. Right? Instead of thinking about how the hell did I get here, ask yourself, okay, what are my options? Where can I go from here? And I think that's a bit of this cart piece where you're not fighting against what's already happened. I did have one more thing I wanted to add to earlier what we were saying. So I think,
Please.
CBT versus Stoicism, kind of like similarities, differences. I mean, one difference that I see is, when the Stoics say, people aren't bothered by things but by their views of them. This is slightly different than like what CBT therapists are saying. So CBT therapists are saying essentially the triangle, right? How you're thinking affects how you're feeling, affects what you're doing. The Stoics aren't so much worried about your thinking. They're worried about like, what are you judging? And actually the very first CBT book written by Chrysippus was destroyed. But no, by Clancy's, but it was destroyed. But we have like remnants of it. And essentially that book on passions, there's this idea that it's our judgments that are driving our emotional responses. And if we can learn to let go of some of our judgments, we won't have all these large emotional responses. And so really, we got really lost in logical positivism. We got really lost in like, okay, is this thought exactly true? We got really lost in, is our thinking distorted? Both are good. But I think we're circling back around to like being non-judgmental in general. But I think that's a good first part to pull into if you want to make your CBT more stoic, would be, I'm less bothered by what exactly are you thinking, and I'm more bothered by what are your judgments about what's happening that's driving this.
Interesting. So as I'm hearing you talk, I'm hearing like different camps in the, I guess, the CBT world. Like there's being less judgmental, which is like in the DBT. I mean, everything started crossing over time and becoming more like trans-theoretical, if you will. But then you have the judgment piece, you have the value piece, which is a bit more acty. Life is inherently filled with suffering, which is a bit more acty, if I'm correct. So is there a sense that the Stoics kind of maybe had everything mostly figured out from a healthy psychological standpoint, and then we kind of like lost it and we're recreating something in the past? Like they seem to have interweaved a lot of what these different camps are talking about, but a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of the original writings were lost as well. And so, I mean, it could be that like we're putting together these dinosaur bones and we're building something, and what we're building is based on our current view of what's happening. And maybe it's all confirmation bias, and maybe it was something entirely different. It's possible. I do think that they had a lot of it figured out, but I don't think it was perfect. The Stoics kind of had this idea, but here's what we need to do. And they would talk about like, in DBT, we talk about like access your wise mind, right? There's this place of inner knowing that you have, and go there and ask yourself what you need to do. The Stoics would say, contemplate the sage, meaning think about someone who you think is really wise. If you were wiser, think about what you would do and then do that. In a sense, so it's trying to like get advice from like a better version of yourself. But at the same time, they would say, but the sage isn't real. It doesn't exist. It's unattainable. And so there were kind of these ideals, and there's also this recognition that like we're all just doing the best we can. I was at ABCT. I don't even remember what year, probably 2016. And Ray DiGiuseppe was talking, and he was commenting on kind of this trend in therapy, right? Where kind of like whatever's old kind of comes back, just like fashion repeats, kind of ideas repeat in therapy. And how a lot of times it feels like we're putting old wine in new bottles. And then he said, but I think there's a refinement. I think every time that we're taking this old wine and putting it in new bottles, I think we're cleaning it up a little bit more, and we're understanding it better. Which it's nice to think, because we're not just recycling, but we're, I guess, distilling. We're making brandy.
Yeah, well, I think it kind of brings me to the, I guess, the other half of the flip side of the coin. What do you think we're doing better with our current understanding? Because I understand like Stoicism is like in the pulse of a lot of the therapies that we do. In what ways do you think we have been more refined? Assuming that the dinosaur bones are put together and a T-Rex looks like a T-Rex. Yeah. How do you think we've evolved since then?
Well, I think we've evolved through like using like an empirical mindset to understand various conditions. So we understand like exposure and response prevention is something that like maybe a Stoic might land on ultimately, but like we understand how to do it really well because we've studied it from every angle. And so I think essentially like we have a good Stoic underpinning, but we're not just Stoics, right? So after Socrates, right, there's kind of there's like the Platonist, which is really kind of metaphysical and interesting, but like not really super useful in therapy, unless you're a metaphysical therapist, then good for you. There's the skeptics who are really focused on, is knowledge really attainable, weighing evidence, seeing if you really know things or not. Notable skeptics would be like Cicero. cynicism is born right out of Socrates. So cynicism is not about being pessimistic, but it's kind of like being like cynical about these conventions. Like everyone says you have to live life this way, but who says you have to live it this way? And there's a little bit of like cynicism of like the opulence of what was going on at the time. And then out of cynicism, Stoicism is born. And it's kind of like a more mild cynicism where there is like a little bit of like cynicism for like convention, but it's more focused on just living a good life. But I think for us, on kind of the more Beck side of the CBT house is Beck also, what's interesting is when he writes about the Stoics who influenced him, he also lists Cicero, which is really weird because Cicero wasn't a Stoic. And if you were like me, you might be like, oh, did he make a mistake? But I think he just included them because he really has this like empirical mindset as well. So I think we've complemented Stoicism, which is how do you live a good life and focus on like control and evaluating your judgments, but then also what are we treating and let's really understand it. And, I think we study PTSD, we study OCD, we study panic disorder, we study things to really understand how to work with it. And so it's not just like a principle-based approach, but it's science and practice put together, which is kind of the art and hard science of it.
Mm-hmm. With our current understanding now with CBT, ACT, EBT, and modern day empirically supported treatments, we could put them in a bucket. Why is it important to even revisit talking about Stoicism or even caring about it at this point?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Do we need it, right? Is there anything that's going to come from it that might complement what we do? Oh, God, I gotta calm myself down. I get so excited. I have so many rants. But I think there's value in absolutely. I think first, like if there's the same general premise, right, they might reach conclusions or have ideas that might be useful for us. There's some places where they're doing things that are actually pretty similar to what we're doing, which is really interesting. Like the Stoics had this intervention or strategy called premeditatio malorum, which we would call stress inoculation training, which essentially is like if something difficult's coming up, you just imagine this difficult thing that you're coming into, and then you imagine it being difficult, and you imagine yourself handling it well, kind of like resilience imagery, where you practice going through the fire, and then you remind yourself, yeah, but I can handle that. And the Stoics would do that. There's various things that they did that we do. So I think it's nice to see how did they do that, which is helpful. I find it to be really helpful because I think, there's a lot of kind of like messaging that people get about mental health, and some of it is constructive and some of it is less constructive, but for whatever reason, Stoicism has good branding with people who might not normally be interested in therapy, right? People who might view therapy as being soft or effeminate or something like that. You view Stoicism as like manly. There was this, remember that this meme, people aren't terminally online like I am. There was like a year ago, this meme format of like, I jokingly asked my boyfriend how often he thinks about ancient Rome, and he said every day. And then every woman was like, "Oh my God, mine too. What's happening?"
I remember this.
So, but there is kind of this like iconography that like is really like attractive, and sometimes it can be like wrapping a pill in cheese, where like it makes it easier for my dog to take it. Where Stoicism can it's a nice vehicle for explaining therapy. And so when we made a New Harbinger workbook based on basically that idea. So we have this workbook from New Harbinger called the Stoicism Workbook, where essentially we're teaching Stoicism to CBT people and CBT to Stoicism people, where there's kind of this cross-pollination where if a CBT person were to read this, they'd say, okay, this is just CBT, but like interesting way of saying it. If a Stoic reads it, they go, okay, this is just Stoicism, but like interesting way of talking about it. So I think part of it is it's just nice to have like an alternate route if you're looking for. If you have some people you're connecting with well and other people you aren't connecting with as much as you want to, it's nice to have a way to do it. It's also just like a nice way to like kind of like introduce maybe self-help to like your father if you're trying to connect with him in some kind of way. It's nice to be saying, hey, I got this book. It's about Rome. Oh, that sounds manly. Read it.
And it has a very ancient-y sounding name, right? It sounds like it's filled with wisdom.
Yeah.
Stoicism.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about putting this into practice.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming that you're a fan of Stoicism, that it must get seen in working with you as a client.
Mm-hmm.
And so for all the therapists that are listening, how might therapy with you look a little bit differently since Stoicism is on the top of your mind?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I have so many things on the top of my mind, right? It's a fun place to be. I mean, so as a cognitive behavioral therapist who specializes in a case conceptualization-based approach, when I first meet with somebody, we spend some time developing a shared conceptualization of the problem. So we're trying to map out, how did we get here? What's maintaining the problem? Why is it still going? What are the paths forward? And then once we talk about the paths forward, even from there, there's going to be different ways to do it, right? If we want to do exposure therapy, we could be taking like an acceptance-based approach where we're focusing on using mindfulness to accept some of the stress that's happening and hold it from a non-judgmental perspective. We could talk about taking more of like a strong, almost like a Reed Wilson stopping the noise in your head kind of approach with like exposure, or a FOA kind of approach. Like, let's just do this. Like, let's just do it. Instead of being afraid of it, we're going to make it afraid of us. Or for some people, I might say, or there's like a third option, right? We could lean into this with like a little bit of like Stoic indifference in a sense, where we could learn to, feel our feelings, but not be bothered by them in a sense. And some people will say, oh, that's cool. Other people say, no, that's not for me. And I think sometimes it's just highlighting, look, what I'm doing is necessarily different, but the way I'm doing it might be, depending on the preference of the person I'm working with. Also, we get a lot of people who come in for therapy who don't fit the DSM, right? We get a lot of people who are coming in and their challenge isn't like, hey, I need this specific protocol, but they're struggling in their lives. And they're looking for like schools and tools to help with like resilience and things where we might not be at a place where there's functional impairment. But we are at a place where somebody isn't really thriving like they want to. And so something that is kind of more like philosophy for living or holistic living is a nice approach as well.
Mm-hmm. So if people do go down this route with you and they say, mm-hmm. I want you to take a Stoic approach, mm-hmm. to my treatment. And sometimes you have people come in that they are asking like, oh, I really want to take an exposure approach to treatment. Mm-hmm. And so you try your best to, as long as it makes sense, to cater the treatment to what the person is looking for, because the more buy-in you have in therapy, the better it's going to be, right? As long as it makes sense for the person. Okay, so the person comes in, they find Scott Waltman because he has a book on Stoicism. Mm-hmm. He's written about it. He has the podcast. He has this, that, and the other. Compared to doing like a more like, let's say, Beckian traditional style CBT, in what way directionally might it look differently session to session in your approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. I I think if I'm being Stoic, I'm also being quite Socratic. And so, I'm thinking up like questions that we're contemplating. I think a good example about how might Stoicism differ from like Beckian CBT. So a classic example you might use if you're working with somebody who's really angry is you might say, so imagine you're driving down the road and someone cuts you off. How do you feel? And then you might say, okay, so now imagine this person's actually, they're in a hurry. And the reason they cut you off is because their wife's in labor and they're taking them to the hospital to give birth. And you go, oh, like I wouldn't be mad about that. Like if you're having a baby, you should be able to drive as fast as you want. That makes sense. So Alice might say, is there maybe, or Beck might say, is there a good explanation for what's going on, right? The Stoics are going to say, it doesn't really matter, right? What the reason is, but like, do I really want to care about if I can't control it, why am I bothered by it in a sense? And so it's less about, other people needing to have like a good reason or like trying to find these like justifications, but it's more about what kind of person do you want to be and what kind of life do you want to live? And do you want to be the kind of person who's really bothered by other people driving? Because bad drivers are universal. No matter where you go, they're there. And if your day is determined by the people you're around, it's going to be hard to have a lot of good days. Similar to what your teacher said in 11th grade, right? But if you can recognize that even if the situation is difficult, right, there's something I can be grateful for. There's something I can appreciate. I can at least take gratitude in my ability to handle it well.
I think that example kind of helped me understand this.
Mhm.
The best the driving example, control no control,
Mhm.
right? You can't control bad drivers or this bad drivers. Is less about why they are doing it, but how do I want to show up in this world?
Yeah.
So acceptance that the world has bad drivers and
Mhm.
there's going to be these days and there's only so much I could do. I don't care why they're doing it, but how do I want to show up? And then how do I tolerate this discomfort of being frustrated to show up as the person that I want to be?
Yeah, exactly. So tools for living in a messy world, or maintaining your integrity in a world that is maybe losing integrity.
Interesting. Have you, and I know this is not going to be a research question, it's more of like a clinical
Uh,
intuition and experience. Have you found certain people respond better to this stoic like I'm thinking about like PTSD
yeah.
treatment. There's CPT and there's prolonged exposure. And I mean, I haven't checked the research literature, but they're like, yeah, they're both super effective. Why choose one versus another is a little bit more of like a grayer area. But in this one, is there a particular client that you feel like this approach, like, is it everybody? Is it a certain type of person that tends to do better with this approach?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? I don't know that I might also just be like really. I think I might just be so excited about Stoicism that when I talk about it, people are excited about it. I might just be kind of too good of a salesperson in that way. Um, I think the people who seek me out specifically for Stoicism, right? Because I'll get referrals for that, right? So I do some work with the CBT Collective, and people might come in and say, "Hey, Scott, like I saw you in this podcast, or you were in this Plato's Academy conference, or whatever, and like I'm interested in Stoicism. I want to learn it. Like, let me work with you." I mean, those are usually folks who are really have like, if you talk about values, usually people have values related to like self improvement, like wanting to like learn more. Kind of these people who see themselves as lifelong learning and see lifelong learning attached to self improvement are usually folks who are really interested in working with me. I think Stoicism is often seen as being kind of more of like a male philosophy, but it's not really necessarily truly that. It might just be kind of like availability heuristic because I mean there's I know two like very prominent female Stoic authors who write just like fantastic stuff and have a lot of good followers and do good works. Um, but I think people who are really just kind of looking for like a framework and tools and ideas, people who want skills for living. Some people talk about like maybe as people we were seeing kind of like a leaving of religion, and maybe some people when they leave religion they're kind of looking for like a code to live by in a sense, and maybe that kind of falls into it. But I don't know. I feel like people who are just like kind of thinkers or curious about life seem to be interested in philosophy, which makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the approach, um, just more generally, like more people should be paying it, like more therapists should be paying attention to it and seeing um, how to integrate it? That do you think that that therapists can be more effective understanding how to look at things from a stoic lens if they're not doing it currently?
Yeah, I think the value in learning Stoicism from a clinical perspective is just having um, more options when you explain something to your clients. Because if you're batting 1,000, you don't need to learn anything else. Just keep doing what you're doing. But no one's batting 1,000, right? But if you have some people you're connecting with well and other folks you aren't connecting with as well, you might stop and ask yourself, like, is there something about these other people that I'm not connecting with as well? For me, Stoicism and CBT are kind of like two ends of the same idea. Like it's all part of this idea about wanting to understand something before we work with it. Right? Beck would say CBT is a way of thinking. Of course, Beck would also say if it works at CBT, which is just my favorite quote because it's so beautiful and ridiculous. But so Beck would absolutely say, yeah, Stoicism, yeah, that's CBT, absolutely. Absolutely. But I think it's worth digging into because it gets you kind of thinking about questions and it gets you thinking about how to have conversations about things, which is nice. My first love before Stoicism was Socratic questioning. And really that's like a conversation or a dialogue. And I think learning philosophy helps you learn to think about things which helps you have good conversations in session. So if my client is struggling because they think like they're unlovable and they look back and they say, well, my mother never loved me. And if if my mother was supposed to love me more than anyone, if she didn't love me, therefore I'm completely unlovable. If somebody who's trained in philosophy, right, I can say, well, there's a lot of assumptions underneath this, right? So I might say, so it sounds like the first question we need to consider is the love we receive equal to the love we deserve? And then we can have a really fruitful conversation around there, which will be a lot easier than just jumping into directly weighing the evidence. So I think sometimes learning Stoicism helps you learn philosophy. Learning philosophy helps you learn to think about like the cognitive structure of things, which might help you understand like where to start evaluating and looking at stuff, which might make you better at Socratic questioning.
Well, just a quick plug because you had teed it up. So Scott had mentioned CBT Collective, which is the new name of my private practice. We just rebranded. My old name was very long, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy and Assessment Associates. If you Google search that, you will find it. But if you are a client or you're a therapist that thinks that working with someone like Scott or someone that has Stoicism, you can reach out to us at CBT Collective, and you could potentially work with Scott or one of our other amazing, great therapists there. And we're also hiring great CBT therapists. We're in Manhattan and in the tri-state area, in the suburbs, New Jersey, Connecticut, Westchester County, Long Island. So if anybody is interested in working with us, you could also find me and reach out, or I'll put in the show notes how to reach out to us.
Absolutely.
But on that note, as a segue, if somebody wants to learn this, because right now, besides talking to you or maybe buying your new book, I don't really know how to learn to approach therapy this way. So how would you recommend people actually get training in this if they're interested?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so there's a word for this, right? The ancient Greeks had this word prokopton or prokopto, which has to do with kind of like someone who's starting a journey. And so if you want to learn Stoicism, you're just getting started. It's an exciting place to be. If you're already a therapist and you kind of know CBT or the basics of CBT and you want to learn Stoicism, I would say buy our book, the Stoicism Workbook from New Harbinger. It's designed to teach you Stoicism if you already know CBT or the other way around. Of course, you can always get into the original sources, which is great. Marcus Aurelius has this fantastic book called Meditations, which is still #1 selling book. And that's a really interesting book. So essentially, Marcus Aurelius had like a private journal where he would sit down and he would reflect on, how do I not screw this up? Because there had been many bad emperors before him. And he was sort of groomed into being like a last hope for Rome. Like they found this one person in the royal family. He wasn't the heir apparent, but he seemed to have a good head on his shoulders. And they said, this guy, we got to get him on the throne because someone's got to save this. And so essentially there were all these deals where essentially his I guess kind of grandpa, not really, said, to Antonius, like the next one, essentially his nephew, hey, I'll adopt you and make you my heir if you adopt Marcus and make him your heir. And so like there was this like moving heaven and earth to get Marcus set up to be the next emperor. They sit him with Junius Rusticus, this like fantastic tutor. Junius teaches him Stoicism. He learns a really good job of it, but he knows like the more power I have, the more capacity I have to really destroy things. And he's really trying to save Rome. And they're fighting a war on two sides. They're surviving a plague. He loses several children to the plague. It's just devastating times. And every day he sits and he's writing, because Junius taught him it's not just enough to learn Stoicism. You need to kind of make it your own. You need to sit down and kind of rewrite it in your own words. So he's essentially kind of rewriting Stoicism in his own words, trying to figure it out. And it later gets published after his death, this Meditations, which it was never meant to be published, which is interesting. It's kind of this like very candid thing. But that's a fantastic book. If you're looking to learn Stoicism, you could check out Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. There's a lot of other popular books, like The Daily Stoic is very popular. Donald Robertson, who I'm a huge fan of, has The Stoic Art of Happiness, which is also a good starting place. You could just start like following accounts online. There's like a million like quotes that you'll see that people post. Fun fact about the quotes is a lot of them aren't real. you gotta be careful, because if you pull it up on like Goodreads or some quote site, that doesn't mean it's like a real thing. So you might find yourself saying a quote that isn't a real quote. Like there's this quote, there's a lot of fake Socrates quotes, and I've been burned many times by them, right? But there's one where Socrates like, I can't teach you anything. I can only fill a vessel, which is beautiful, but that's not really him. Socrates saying like, after, when the debate is over, like if someone's losing, they'll turn to slander. Socrates never said that. There's this quote from Socrates saying, get married. If you have a good wife, you'll be happy. Otherwise, you'll be a philosopher. Socrates never said that. There's all these like really, really famous quotes. There's like, anyways. But you can check that out. That's fine. So our book is a good starting place. Just finding some podcasts is a good place. You could check out our podcast that we started, the Apprentified and Codependent Rescuer Trap is a good place. Yeah, it's a good place there's a lot of good places to get started.
So I know you mentioned a lot of bad quotes. If there's one like really good quote that people will know is true, is there one that you love that might reflect Stoicism?
Oh, yeah. I think there's a lot that really reflects Stoicism, right? I have a favorite quote, and then I think maybe a most typical quote, right? So a most typical quote might be when Seneca says something to the effect of like if it's outside of my control, it means nothing to me. So in a sense, like I'm only going to worry about things I can control. If I can't control it, I'm not going to worry about it. For me, my favorite quote is actually Epictetus has this quote, which has been called now the two-handle approach, where he essentially says something like, if you have problems with someone, or if you're in a difficult situation with them, he said, don't grab the handle about like being mad at them. Like there's more than one way to approach the situation. So if you try and grab the handle of like, I'm mad at you, you did me wrong, you can't lift them up. No one can be lifted up from a place of anger. But instead, if you grab the handle of like, I'm your brother, we came up together, we have a lot of history, this is a handle that lifts. This is the handle that can help improve the situation. To me, I think that's a really nice view of Stoicism, because it highlights that while it is very practical, it's not seclusive. It's not this like rugged individualism idea, but it's this idea about like, we want to be practical. We want to have emotions, but not be driven by them. But also, as Marcus Aurelius would say, what's bad for the hive is bad for the bee. Like we're all meant to work together. And then as a therapist, I might take that quote and then say, okay, but like, what if you apply that to yourself? Because it's such a therapist question, right? So if you're trying to change yourself, you can't lift yourself up from this handle of being mad at yourself, right? You can't beat yourself down and lift yourself up at the same time. But instead, if you can grab this handle that, like, you have history together, you love yourself, you've always been there for yourself, you want good things for yourself, that self-compassion can lift yourself, which is a nice.
No, it's a very it is a very pretty quote, one that I never heard before.
Yeah, so. We talk about it, and I should send you a copy of the book. I think it's in chapter 8. I think we focus on self-compassion. Hope you can hear me. Yeah. Chapter 8.
So for many, the world has become more stressful and more uncertain in modern times. Is there anything in Stoicism that could help people that are struggling or dealing with this increased stress and uncertainty navigate it better?
Yeah. Absolutely, right. I think, when Marcus was writing, right, he was in very uncertain times, right? There was major wars happening. There was like a political instability happening. There was this plague, kind of their own COVID situation happening, right? And he's essentially writing like, how do you find yourself grounded when the world isn't grounded, right? Epictetus, after looking back on his experience of being enslaved, and writing about how do you live a good life even when the world isn't always good, and how do you still be a good person and not lose yourself? I think definitely goes in there, right? There's this line. So, everything happens in context, right? So, one of the most famous ancient Stoics, Seneca, was the tutor for Nero. Nero was a terrible tyrant, and Nero was really mad at the Stoics and essentially exiled almost all of them. And when they were being exiled, so Musonius Rufus, who later taught Epictetus, and Theresa were friends, and they're getting exiled. And Theresa basically says, like, being exiled is the worst. This is dishonorable. I'll be away from my family. I can't stand it. I'd rather be dead than exiled. Like, life could never be worse. I should kill myself. And there's this like dialogue where Musonius is like, okay, but like maybe you could stand this. Like maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe you still have a choice, and you should recognize that the person who gave you a choice, there's like a little bit of theism in here. Like maybe there's a person who gave you a choice, and you should honor this choice, and there might be more in life for you, and you should see if you can live with it. But there's kind of like themes that might sound like radical acceptance. It might seem like, okay, life might feel hopeless, but is all hope lost? And I mean, from there, right? Like they survived. They came back. They were exiled 2 more times. They still survived. Nero was eventually put out, and that was taken care of. But then Musonius Rufus goes on to teach Epictetus, who goes on to influence Marcus Aurelius, who goes on to write a book that has been read by millions, if not billions, of people at this point. Like it's amazing to look at how the ripples that can happen in life.
Mm-hmm. How way leads on to way, right? Not every good thing leads to good things, and not every bad thing leads to bad things, or a bad thing could lead to a bad thing to lead to a bad thing, which then could lead to a good thing.
Yeah.
I think sometimes, maybe due to media or whatever, and I talk about this a lot when I work with clients, where people think that only good things lead to good things. And it's a very trapping way of looking at life, because every bad thing that happens then has no meaning if you think bad just leads to bad.
Right. Or if you think that things, sometimes I get kind of a slightly different version of that with my folks, where they'll come in and they'll say, okay, these good things happen, but they don't count because then these bad things happened. And the good things only really count if it stays good. Instead of recognizing there's kind of seasons to life, right? Things like if you start a business and it's successful for 20 years and then the landscape changes and it goes out of business, are you a failure because your business went out, because you eventually went out of business? Are you a success because you had 20 years, right? Or are you a success just because like you worked hard and you did what you could?
Mm-hmm. That brings me to one. So I know nothing about Nero except for I know the name. I've seen it in a lot of movies, but it sounds like he wasn't like the best guy. Is that
No.
correct? Okay.
Yeah.
So the thing that I find interesting in some of these philosophies that are based on living by your values is what if the person's values are grossly misguided?
Yeah.
With Stoicism, where people say, well, those are his values, so that's how he should align himself. Like, are there any rules around how to have good values? And is that a trap? Because then now you have a paradigm deciding what a good value, like what values are. I don't know if that's convoluted or if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're saying, so if you have all these, especially like post-Socratic philosophy was really focused on like ethical living, and some people might call it the philosophy of ethics. But then you might say, okay, but all of this ethics takes place within the context of a person. And what if that person had values which maybe were okay then, but maybe aren't okay now? Although you might say maybe they weren't actually okay then. For example, Seneca was a slave owner, which we would agree is bad. But if you look back at what Seneca's writing, do we say, okay, but like it wasn't immoral? I don't know that we could even say it wasn't immoral to own slaves, because I don't know that that's like a moral relativism I can get behind. But if it was accepted practice to be a slave owner at that point, should we then kind of look the other way on it, or should we not judge him for it? I don't know. For me, it's definitely something I keep in my mind, right? When I read Seneca and I'm reading what he's saying, I'm also keeping in mind, okay, this is the context of who he was. And there's a lot of times where it feels like he's talking the talk, but not walking the walk. But there certainly were Stoics who were opposed to slavery, and there's different kind of views there, right? So sometimes I might kind of compare Epictetus, who was enslaved, to Seneca, who owned slaves. And I might look and see kind of discrepancies in what they're saying from each other. But it is a challenge, though, right? Is looking at these different individuals and trying to understand, is there a piece of this that's useful, but also do I want to? The goal isn't to make it a cult, right? The goal isn't to say, okay, Seneca said this, therefore this is the way it is, therefore I have to buy this because it's just something some dude said.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like we could do a whole nother episode on just defining what good morals are and what good ethics are, and what philosophers say of like how do you develop that, right? Like how do you develop a moral compass? How do we know that it's the correct moral compass versus an incorrect moral compass? And I think history over time, what they defined as being okay versus not okay versus not moral has switched a lot. And it's just an interesting, because over time, our field has become a lot more values based.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And so the question is like, how are we, I mean, my question goes into how are people defining their values and then looking at it in a bigger message, but bigger picture, sorry, not message. Okay. Sorry, I meant to ask this before, but it doesn't sound like there's any like training courses that like workshops that people could go to and like watch, like Stoicism Now, how to enhance your CBT.
Oh, I got you. Oh, you know what? Actually, it's funny you used to say that, because if anyone's going to ABCT, Trent Codd, who also is part of the CBT collective, Trent Codd and I are doing a panel workshop on Stoicism and anger. So there's actually a lot of like very direct advice and interventions from like the ancient Stoics talking about how to manage anger, which is really compatible with CBT for anger, or Big Tent CBT for anger. So we'll be talking about that. I am teaching a course for Art Med. It might only be available in Portuguese though.
Okay.
So if you check out Plato's Academy has like quarterly conferences which are free to attend, but like donation based, which talk about like kind of Stoicism for living. I mean, there's like courses you could take at like a university, although sometimes those end up being a bit more academic than I might be interested in.
Yeah, and not therapy and application. Okay, so that's interesting. So right now there isn't there's some writings or some books or some podcasts on like integrating Stoicism into CBT, but there at least on top of your mind, there's no like workshop that you can sit down. Well, it's something you might consider. Who knows? Maybe we'll see a Scott Waltman 8-week course on Stoicism and CBT or something like that. I don't know. Yeah. To be determined.
I like it.
Okay, great. So what's next for you in this chapter of you did Socratic questioning. Now you're on a Stoicism book. What's next for you?
I feel like I do so much, right? So we're the second edition for the Socratic Questioning for Therapists and Counselors book is coming along. That'll be out soon. We're still just kind of cleaning up the last little bits, which is exciting. It's been like a labor of love because I put my whole heart into that book, and now like revising something that you love so much is both like agonizing and beautiful. But that's coming along. I mentioned there's another book I'm currently writing for New Harbinger, The Rescuer Trap, which is really focused on, for folks, a lot of people who find themselves going into the helping professions like counseling, nursing, coaching, teaching, have a lot of empathy and sometimes find themselves in situations where they're maybe in relationships that aren't very reciprocal. So we might call someone a rescuer if there's someone who's often kind of engaging in rescuing behaviors and maybe has like not a lot of balance in their life. So we're looking at like a Stoic approach to that, which is still like our version of Stoicism, right? So not like cold Stoicism, but like compassionate Stoicism where you're being fair with yourself and others. So we're working on that. That's coming along. It's keeping me pretty busy.
Okay. Well, I mean, you always are doing a lot. You're flown. I think you went to Brazil recently to do some trainings and stuff like that. So if you're generally, Stoicism isn't the only thing that Scott talks about. So if you do a quick Google search, there's a lot of different trainings and webinars and seminars that he has hosted if you're interested in doing that. Well, before I say farewell, any last thoughts or points that you want to talk about?
I mean, obviously my favorite philosophy quote would be Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, where they meet Socrates and they say, all we are is dust in the wind. But then later on they say, be excellent to each other, right? And I think that's the whole goal of this whole thing. It's just how do we be excellent with ourselves and be excellent with each other and just try and focus on having a nice compassionate excellence.
I have not thought about Bill and Ted in probably a decade. That's great.
At least once a day for me, I guess. Yeah.
That's funny. I can't even remember the last time I watched that movie. But anyway, Scott, like always, thanks so much for coming on the show, and it was great having you on.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.